Welcome to Not Local. This is Zeke. Today's guest is Ambassador Barbara Bodine. Ambassador Bodine served for over 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service. She was the U.S. Ambassador to Yemen from 1997 to 2001. She was the Deputy Principal Officer in Baghdad during the Iran-Iraq War between 1990 and 1991, and returned to Baghdad in 2003 as the first coalition coordinator for the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, and has since served in a number of other distinguished posts in the State Department. She's currently a professor at Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. The ambassador has had quite an eventful State Department career, and while we only focus on a few of her experiences here, she's certainly worth reading about. In this conversation, you will hear the ambassador mention a film entitled No End in Sight. If you've not had the opportunity to watch it, I highly recommend giving it a watch. It provides a lot more context for the substance of our conversation here. This was a real treat for me, and I can honestly say that the ambassador has been a pleasure to speak with throughout the whole process. So many thanks to her. And now I give you Ambassador Barbara Bodine.
All right, I'm here with Ambassador Barbara Bodine. Ambassador, thank you for speaking to me today. First things first, can you please just briefly describe your background and summarize your career in the Foreign Service for me?
Oh my God, that's not an easy opening question. My background is, I guess the short, important part, primarily raised in California, not a native. Raised in California, my late ex-stepfather, obviously not a close relationship, was in the Navy. So we moved around a lot, 10 elementary schools in 6 years. Finally settled down in Southern California. For your purposes, for anybody who knows the Los Angeles area, it was the west end of the San Fernando Valley, which is like no place at all. I basically just I wanted to get out. I did not want to spend the rest of my life in the valley. But I had no idea what to do with it. It was not a place that had a lot of role models. And it was, to be perfectly honest, not a time when most women had careers. And so it's sort of like, yeah, out, but to where? Between my junior and senior year of high school, I was selected for this small seminar course on international relations. All of a sudden, started really getting into foreign policy, international relations, the world. I was geeky enough that I was already reading the LA Times, front to back. But I didn't know what to do with my interest in politics. I had no idea. And I suddenly discovered that there was this world that studied and worked on foreign policy. And the professor had people come out from the consulate generals in Los Angeles, probably the junior vice consul, but when you're 15 years old, they were very impressive. And I got intrigued with who are these people who actually do international relations. I didn't know you could do it. I had a vague idea you could study it, but I had no idea that you could do it. And I finally asked one of them when I walked them back to their car, what is it that you do? And he explained diplomacy and foreign service. And I went, bingo, that's it. I only applied to one undergraduate school, which is not a smart thing to do, but I particularly I wanted to do Asian studies. And UC Santa Barbara had one of the best programs, so I applied to UC Santa Barbara. I also wanted to do a year abroad, and the headquarters for education abroad was at Santa Barbara, so I figured I got a better chance of getting in if I can go over and talk to them. That was that. And I went to Santa Barbara. I did do a year abroad in Hong Kong. While I was there, I got to know the people at the Consulate General very well, and they were unbelievably patient. with a college junior. And, but I really liked who they were. I liked what they did. They explained diplomacy to me. And one of them said, well, if you're going to go to the Foreign Service, you have to take the exam, but you also have to go to graduate school. There's only one graduate school to go to, and that was not Georgetown, it was Fletcher. And so I applied to one graduate school. And before I went to graduate school, I took the Foreign Service exam and passed it. So I came into the Foreign Service 3 weeks after I got my master's. Went to Hong Kong as my first tour, which was great, having gone there as a student to go back as a diplomat, 22-year-old diplomat, which is almost an oxymoron. Went to Bangkok and then came back and worked on the secretary's staff and ended up moving over to the Middle East, first by happenstance and then by choice, and ended up spending my career mostly in the Middle East, mostly on the Arabian Peninsula. When we were asked in my orientation class for the Foreign Service how long we all intended to stay, and I said 10 years. I was 22. That's half my life. I couldn't think longer than 10 years. And I ended up staying for 33. So I liked it.
Yeah.
I liked it.
Such a common thing that I've observed from a lot of people who enter the Foreign Service is either people leave fairly quickly or they stay for the long haul. And it's very unique in that sense.
Well, it's either the right choice or it's not. And if it's not the right choice, you know that pretty quickly. You're not happy. You're not doing well. So people quit either within the first 5 years or they stay as long as they possibly can.
You mentioned your experience joining the Foreign Service and the opportunities for women at the time. And I've seen you in a previous interview talking about some of the experiences you had when you first entered the Foreign Service that sort of dealt with sexism. And I've heard accounts of other officers that sexism was fairly common decades ago. I'm curious to know if over the course of your time in the Foreign Service, did you see that the State Department made progress in terms of inclusivity, and what would you say are areas they still need to work on, if any?
Well, I mean, it isn't that the Foreign Service was sexist when I came in. Society was. Mm-hmm. And if I had gone to work, in a law firm or as a doctor, or even, women were supposed to be elementary school teachers, not high school teachers. They weren't supposed to get a master's. They weren't supposed to get a PhD. They weren't supposed to go into a profession. And if you did go into a profession, they didn't put any money into you because you were going to leave as soon as you got married. Certainly the military was no better. I mean, that was the world then. Yeah. Full stop. I vaguely recall that I was the only one in the poli-sci department as an undergrad, as a woman. When I went to graduate school, there were 9 women graduate students. 9. I have more students. I had 7 women students in my graduate class this spring. I was the only woman officer in Hong Kong. I was the only woman officer in Bangkok. I was the only woman officer for about my first 4 or 5 tours. When I entered the Foreign Service, there were 2 women in my entering class, and I was one of them. I was 50%. And I was actually told on my 3rd day by one senior officer that I really wasn't supposed to be there. He actually said I was a mistake. Now that's warming. I was very lucky, which I didn't hear, by the way. I heard nothing about that when I was in my junior year in Hong Kong and I was hanging out at the consulate. First of all, they were all guys, and none of them at all dissuaded me from going into the Foreign Service. In fact, they said, this is what you need to do and you need to go to graduate school. But nobody said, honey, no, you're not supposed to do this. So my first contact with the State Department was very supportive, very welcoming, very encouraging. My orientation class, okay, one guy said I was a mistake, but another guy said ignore him. So, okay, we're good. My first tour, I was the only woman, and I was the juniorest officer in all of the consulate. All of my bosses, all of my supervisors were very supportive, very encouraging, very patient, very tolerant of the inevitable mistakes that you will make. But they were, this is good. My second tour, I did run, straight into a wall. And so I show up, junior officer, still in the political military section, only woman in the huge embassy, one of our 10 biggest. My boss shows me my office, and it has no office, but I'm junior, so that's to be expected. But it has the coffee pot, the refrigerator, and the hot plate. And I realized that he had put me in the office kitchen. Lacks subtlety. Lacks any subtlety whatsoever. And he also gave me nothing to do. I had no portfolio. I will say that all the other guys in the section, were very supportive. Okay, you have nothing to do, so why don't you come along on my meeting? Why don't you just come along and tag along? But I also went to the senior officers and said, I'm up for tenure. This guy's giving me nothing to do. We have 2 other political sections. We have a number of consulates. Can you just transfer me? It ultimately got to the ambassador, and I was met with him. How are you doing? Everything's fine, sir. What am I going to say? I'm talking to the ambassador. And his chief of staff, who knew the story, said, tell the ambassador. So I said, I'm in the kitchen. I have no portfolio. I have nothing to do. I'm up for tenure, and if I stay here, my career is going to end. Although I hope I said it a little bit nicer than that, but that was the short version. Ran into the ambassador 2 weeks later, and he said, can you hang on for a couple more weeks? Sure. I thought I was going to be transferred. My boss was transferred out of the consulate, out of the embassy. He was the 3rd ranking person in the embassy. He was transferred out, sent back to Washington, and told to retire. Okay.
Right. So that was a moment of validation there, huh?
That was the moment that I went, I'm here. Yeah, I had no business winning that one. And the fact that I did, that said everything I needed to know. Did I run into sexism? I think this guy was full on misogyny. Did I run into sexism, sexist jokes, sexist people, what we would call microaggressions now? Of course I did. I still do. I got validated on my second tour. I had a great career. I was the first woman officer, almost every job you can see on my CV. I was the first woman in the consulate, the first woman in the embassy, the first whatever I did. That happened because the system, whatever you call it, and the men I worked with made sure that I got these assignments. I got these opportunities. I got asked to do jobs that I never would have thought of. Fortunately, there were people with better imaginations about what I could do professionally than sometimes I had. And they pushed and pulled me along. I think I earned their trust and validated their decision. But I ran into people, but I didn't have a system that was blocking me.
You were on an airplane from, I think, Chicago to Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, during the attack on the U.S.S. Cole.
Actually, I was on a plane from St. Louis to Chicago to Sana'a.
Got
so
it.
Yes.
Okay. You were in that chain of flights. Okay.
Yes, very long flights. Yes.
So, can you tell me what the experience was like when you landed in Sana'a, and what, if anything, about your mission in Yemen changed after that event?
Well, I would say everything changed. Everything. Yeah, it was a long flight, to say the least. The plane gets in at Sana'a at midnight, so I had stayed awake so that when I got to Sana'a, I could go home and go to bed and try to get on a regular schedule. My plane landed, somebody from the cabin crew, ambassador, there are people waiting for you. Could you please exit the plane? Very nice, very nicely. And I get to the top of the stairs, old airport, and my deputy chief of mission is there. I never had my staff meet my plane when I came back because it was always at midnight, and my house was 15 minutes away. I don't need a welcoming party. So if my DCM is there, something bad has happened. And I walk up to him and he said, one of our naval ships has blown up in Aden Harbor. Well, has blown up kind of implies like there was an industrial accident. The ship itself went boom. I said, oh, okay, well, that's horrible. Tell me about it. I said, it blew up? And he says, well, actually, it was blown up. That's entirely different. Mm-hmm. That is cataclysmically, significantly different. What happened? So, but he said, I have a ticket for you to get on the first flight to Aden at 3:00 this morning. It's midnight. And I have to go down to Aden to find out about a ship that was blown up, and you don't know anything about it. Okay. Go back to the residence, throw my suitcase open, pack, a very small suitcase, and I get on a 3:00 flight, and I go to Aden, and I'm there before dawn. The Navy, which was already there, obviously, we went down and visited the ship, and I toured the ship with the captain, and it was very clear that it was a terrorist incident. The metal of the ship was bent inward towards the ship, so it was clearly external. So, okay, we have a terrorist incident. We have 17 killed. The ship is about to sink. We got to take care of this. To be honest, working on the aftermath of U.S.S. Cole attack was all I did for the remaining 10 months I was there. And it was all my embassy did. I mean, there were other things, but that was the overwhelming focus mission that we did for the remainder of my time in Yemen. That's all we did.
I mean, I know that U.S. embassies all over the world are working on a whole bunch of projects, improving democracy, elections, anti-corruption. So all that stuff, when there's a terror attack, all that stuff is sideburnered at the time.
Basically, I mean, one of the issues I had was to try to increase the import of Washington State apples to Yemen. I did not get around to that for the next 10 months. I got into Aden and set up shop, we did not have any presence in Aden prior to the attack. So we basically had to set up an embassy annex in Aden, several hundred miles away. We had to bring staff. We had to set everything up from scratch. We had as I said, I got there at about 4:30 in the morning. 5:30 in the afternoon, I'm told that one U.S. government plane is coming in, and it was I had been the coordinator for counterterrorism, and it was a emergency support team that U.S. government sends out to incidents like this. And so I knew everybody. I knew all about them. So I said, oh, well, I'll go down to Aden Airport and meet them because these are my friends. This is my old office. And Lord, do I need the help. And I get to Aden Airport, which is about this big, and there isn't one U.S. government plane on the tarmac. There's 7. There's a plane from the Joint Special Operation Command. There is a plane from the U.S. Navy Marine Contingent in Manama. There's an FBI plane. There's an NCIS plane, and there were 2 others, and I can't remember who they were. We didn't have 15 people getting off a plane. We had dozens and dozens and dozens. None of the flights had been cleared coming into Aden. If you can imagine a U.S. airport with 7 foreign military planes landing, basically unannounced, we would have just shot them out of the sky. Yemenis let them land. I didn't know that any of them were coming. They kind of forgot to tell the U.S. government, kind of forgot to tell the U.S. embassy that they were coming. So all of these planes and all of these people are stuck on the tarmac. Because Yemenis are going, who are these people? What are they doing? What are they bringing into our country? Who are they? It's a very fair question. Exactly the same question I had. We ended up with, I don't know how many different government agencies, but mostly FBI, Special Operations, NCIS, and State Department Diplomatic Security. All of them with their own, and of course we had large contingents of the Navy there. And the first thing I had to do was to put together kind of a country team. We got to get ourselves organized because right now we've just got people. We need to get organized. So we had, my job was, okay, what are our mission? Mission 1, secure the ship and secure the crew and take care of the wounded and the casualties. Mission 2, force protection. We have to protect all these people that we've brought in because we don't know if there's another attack. Mission 3, establish a joint investigation on what happened. And then mission 4 was to work with the Yemeni government to make mission 1, 2, and 3 possible.
Yeah.
Because we are in a sovereign state, and it is a friendly government, and it is actually a friendly environment with a terrorist incident. And so those are our 4 missions. And my job and my team's job was to keep all of those moving simultaneously. Because you get that many different government agencies, and you're going to start playing bump car. And you don't have time to play bump car. You have a mission. The ship, the investigation, the intelligence gathering, all have to be working together. Trying to get all of that to work together with everybody is focused on their mission. Right. My job, keep everything moving together. Sometimes in spite of ourselves.
I think one thing that sticks out in that amalgam of U.S. agencies that come out to support you is the FBI, because I think a lot of people imagine that the FBI is this domestic intelligence agency. So it was confusing, I think, upon reading about it, that the FBI was one of the agencies that comes out to investigate. You just talked about how sometimes these agencies' missions bump. And so there's famously was friction between the FBI and the Yemenis, and I know you were in between all of that. But what made that friction so hot between them?
Well, I mean, the FBI, and you're right, the FBI is not a domestic intelligence, they're domestic law enforcement. Their job is to gather evidence that can stand up in court for conviction. That's their mission. They don't have extraterritorial authority. They don't. So you have to work with the host government.
Yeah.
A bunch of, to be perfectly blunt, a whole bunch of white FBI agents who don't speak Arabic are not going to be able to get information from the local population. They can't. So it was a joint Yemeni U.S. investigation. It had to be. Had to be. So that was one friction. We also had tension between the FBI to a certain extent and the Navy. The Navy sees the ship. First of all, it's theirs. Second of all, their crew. Third, their 17 sailors who were killed. This is for them to keep the ship from sinking, which it almost did, and to get the casualties, get the wounded off, get the casualties repatriated. The FBI sees the ship as a crime scene. They want to basically put yellow tape all the way around an Aegis cruiser. Oh, the FBI wants to get the people, the remains, the wounded, and everybody else off. So you've got a tension there. We had a question of force protection, which is basically who's going to guard everybody. The Marines, all 75 of them, their job is to do protection. FBI wants to bring in guns. Marines kind of go, no, we do the guns, you do the investigation. So I've got another one. I have NCIS. NCIS thinks that this is their investigation because it happened on a Navy ship. NCIS, FBI. The issues between the U.S. government and the Yemeni were the easiest part compared to all of these other territories, mandates, authorities, all bumping up against each other and trying to keep, okay, how do we reconcile all of this? There was obviously tension with the Yemenis. And if you ever watch any crime shows on TV, the FBI goes in and the local sheriff is kind of like, excuse me, but this is my town. Mm-hmm. Well, if the FBI has that problem domestically, make that international. Right. This is our country. And the Yemenis, and I think this is, an important point, they saw the attack on the coal as an attack on Yemen, as well as an attack on the U.S. And it was. It was an attack in Yemen. So the Yemenis want to get to the bottom of this too. They want to know who is doing this kind of stuff in their country. But Yemen is a very poor country and a very undeveloped country. So you have the FBI coming in with NCIS-like whiz-bangy stuff on investigation, working with a national law enforcement that doesn't even have fingerprint powder. They can't talk to each other. We want this, and this, and we want it right now. And the Yemenis are kind of going, we don't have that, and that. Besides, they don't move that fast. So we're trying to, you've got two, not Yemeni American culture clash, but an FBI Yemeni law enforcement capability gap that is achingly frustrating. The Yemenis were not hostile, but they didn't have the capability and the competency to keep up. And that was absolutely frustrating. And then you add all of the internal. It was a full-time job. I had FBI and NCIS agents, well, not NCIS, FBI agents who had also been involved in the bombing of Dar es Salaam and Nairobi. And they said that the Yemeni cooperation was weeks ahead of what they were getting from the Kenyans and the Tanzanians. That they were doing everything they could within their capability and being as cooperative as they possibly could. But you had this clash of capability. And so trying to keep the FBI, CIS, Marines, the Joint Operations people, and a partridge in a pear tree all heading in the same direction. Yes, that was my full-time job.
That ranks up there for me. I don't know everything that's ever happened in the world in terms of Foreign Service history, but it has to rank high on the list of the most complex international issues that's ever happened.
Yes, it was quite something. Okay, the good news is we were able to repatriate the 17 sailors we lost. We were able to get all of the wounded to first responder care and then evacuated to the French military hospital in Djibouti, of all places. We did not lose a single wounded sailor. The ship did not sink. There were no further attacks on any Americans or anybody else. And it was a reasonably successful investigation. There were Yemenis who were arrested and put in jail. There are people in Guantanamo who were connected with the coal. I think basically, given what we were handed, what we had to work with, and the environment in which we had to work with it, I think it came out as well, better than we could have expected. Perfect? No, there is no perfect.
Going from one of the most complex issues in U.S. history internationally to another one.
Yeah.
You were then tasked by Washington to be the senior State Department official for the reconstruction of the Iraqi government in Baghdad, right?
Yeah, close.
What was your...
Okay. I was pulled out of Santa Barbara, where I was on sabbatical after Yemen. And yes, I was sent as the senior state official in the early reconstruction, the office of Orha. There was one senior person who had Kurdistan, one senior person who had the South, primarily Shia. There was one senior person who was actually responsible for reconstructing the government, but that's another story. One who was doing humanitarian affairs. What I got was Baghdad, and so I had the center of Iraq, including Baghdad, which was about 40% of the population, and obviously the major city. So that was my writ, which was big enough.
Right. So,
but I wasn't the overall. I just want to make it clear there was
okay.
there was a guy who was in charge of all of us.
Mm-hmm.
So I was one of 6, okay. And then the guy up there.
Gotcha. So before you go in to Baghdad, there is a project in the hands of the United States government already called the Future of Iraq Project. And just to briefly describe this to listeners, this was a joint effort by the U.S. State Department and 200 Iraqi professionals consisting of lawyers and doctors and engineers, highlighting risks for reconstruction of the Iraqi government after the removal of Saddam. I'm sure you've been asked before why this plan wasn't enacted, but with your familiarity with whatever you recall of it, I know this is a long time ago now.
Oh, it's all seared in my memory. Don't worry about that.
What from that plan? Were there ideas from that plan that you believe would have produced more constructive results than what ended up happening?
Almost anything would have been more constructive than what happened. Just to there was a Future of Iraq project, you're quite right. It was directed by the State Department, but it included virtually every agency of the U.S. government, the Labor Department, Commerce, you name it. Somebody from the U.S. government was involved in that piece. Certainly people from public health and USAID and God knows. It was mandated by the White House. It was funded by Congress. It wasn't something that we did out of our back pocket. And I think it went on for I want to say a year, maybe even 18 months. It was massive, and it did include Iraqis. So you have the U.S. government, you had academics, NGOs, Iraqis, everybody literally looking at how do you put a government and a country back together. Massive project, as described by somebody in a movie or a documentary about this. About 4 board feet of reports were done. How do you rebuild a Ministry of Foreign Affairs? What do you do about this? What do you about everything? There's a quote from Eisenhower that the value of a plan is in the planning. I have always amended that the value of a plan is in the planners, because you sit down and you work through, you talk through, you argue, you game plan, you red team. What do we need? How do we do it? What are the problems? You've thought it through. Now, the other thing from the military is that every plan falls apart when it hits reality. So was the plan a template that you just impose? Of course not. But these people had all worked through the whatabouts and the what ifs and the who's and the how's. They had these conversations. It at least was a well thought through, well considered, well argued starting place. In January of 2003, the White House shifted the lead on Iraq to the Department of Defense, to Mr. Rumsfeld. The Department of Defense explicitly rejected all of the findings of the Future of Iraq project. All of the people who had been involved, state, Iraqi, NGO, public health, whomever, everybody who was involved in the Future of Iraq project was excluded explicitly. The plan was excluded explicitly. We're just going to go in and it's going to be, chocolates and roses, or whatever that was, that phrase from Cheney was. Liberators, and we're going to turn the government over to the Iraqis, and thank you very much, we're out of here. This is a country that, first of all, has been not just our war against Iraq. They had Kuwait, the Iran-Iraq war. This country had been in military conflict for decades. And under Saddam Hussein, and everybody who preceded him was not a whole lot better. This wasn't a country in many ways. And we're just going to go in, decapitate the top, and then turn it over to who to do what. This is a plan. There was no plan. So when everybody figured out that everybody who actually had done the Future of Iraq was excluded, Secretary Powell called me in Santa Barbara. And I actually got a call from his office saying, the secretary will meet you in his office at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. You do know I'm in California, don't you? Yeah? There's these things called aeroplanes, So off I go. And I was asked to go over and be the senior state person. And even though I had served in Iraq and worked in the Middle East and done all this stuff, the guys at DOD didn't do due diligence on who I was. Best anyone can figure out. So they hired me. And I was actually supposed to do the civil administration reconstruction, the government side, but that was taken. And so the only thing that was left was Baghdad and the whole center of the country. So I volunteered for that, and that was on a Thursday at the end of February. And I showed up on Monday as coordinator for the central governance with my DOD building pass that I still have. Said, I'm here. Where's the plan? Where's my staff? And I was told there is no plan and you have no staff. This is the first week in March of 2003. Yeah. Like, okay. And they said, if you want staff, you go out and recruit them. Okay. What am I going to need to rebuild the mega city of Iraq that has just been bombed or is about to just be bombed by us? So I started recruiting people and everything else. Middle of March, and we had no plan whatsoever. Middle of March, we're sent to Kuwait. And early April, I am the first civilian into Iraq, and the fighting is still going on. And I've got me and one guy and a walkie-talkie, or satellite phone. Okay.
More with less.
Yeah. This is clean slate approach. Just before I left Kuwait, there were 2 Hill staffers that DOD had refused to give clearance to come out to Kuwait to meet with us. And so I knew them and I said, you need to go to the embassy in Kuwait and have the embassy invite you and you come on that side. And then we just happened to get together and I got them into a dinner with General Gardner, who was the big guy. And we're having dinner, and this is just before we're about to go in. And so one of the staffers says, well, what's the plan? And General Gardner says, well, we're going to go in and we're going to get the government up and running. Like the Iraqi government has been on pause, like a DVD machine. So the government's been on pause. We're going to take them off of pause. The government's going to start running. We're going to have a constitutional convention. We're going to write a constitution. We're going to ratify a constitution. We're going to have elections. And then we're going to have a president. And then we're going to turn the government over to the Iraqis. And the staffer says, well, by when? He says, by August. And the staffer goes, what year? He says, this year. This is March, April of 2003. And we're going to do that. It took the South Africans 4 years to write their constitution. And we're going to do all of that by August.
I mean, I imagine that you raised your hand and said, no.
I think I was too, I think it's called a Fauci.
Yes.
Yeah. It was just like, that's insane. That's insane. We went into Iraq with no resources, no plan, 120 civilians to run a shattered, traumatized country of 25 million. There are more staffers at Georgetown University than we took into Baghdad to run a country. Of course it was a failure. Of course we failed.
What I'm gathering from this is that the DOD was not particularly good at understanding what they didn't know. And I hope that's a lesson that's been learned, but I feel more optimistic than maybe I should be on that.
Well, I hope it's a lesson that's been learned. I do want to say it wasn't the military that was doing this. This was Rumsfeld and his inner circle and the vice president's office. They really, their plan was we were going to get rid of Saddam. We were going to put a gentleman named Ahmed Chalabi, who was very close to the neoconservatives. He was going to be our guy, and we were going to turn the government over to him. We weren't going to do nation building. They actually wanted to use Iraq's oil to rebuild Iraq, which is against the Geneva Convention. You can't do that. We had this disconnect that we were going to take the Iraqi government off pause and all these people were going to come back to work and run the country for us. But we had explicitly no plan on how to pay them. And after I left, we got rid of everybody who was a member of the Ba'ath Party. That was essentially the entire government. Because you joined the Ba'ath Party not because you were a Ba'athi, but to survive.
Yeah.
So we gutted the government. We demobilized the military. We sectarianized every institution. We put no people behind it, no plan behind it, and we were going to install a new dictator. Tell me what about that game plan is going to work.
Yeah.
It was remarkable.
I can't imagine what it's like to be in your position, just watching it happen, and there's nothing you can do.
Nothing. I mean, try to do a little bit with the little bit I've got, knowing that this is doomed to failure.
Yeah.
It is a failure on our part. I don't know if the Future of Iraq project and all of the people who were involved and all of the thinking, if that had gone into Baghdad and those people had gone into Baghdad, I cannot say that we would have set up the Switzerland of the Middle East. But I think we would have had a firmer foundation.
Yeah, there's so many things that I would imagine the world could have avoided had we been a little smarter about how we dealt with the situation in Iraq. But
if we just used our own smarts,
yeah,
we had the smarts.
Yeah,
we had the smarts. We had the people. We had people who spoke Arabic. We had people who did post-construction reconstruction. We had public health people who did, we had the people. The academic world had them. The NGO world had them. The government had them. There were the people. We had the plan. We didn't use it. That's the story. If you haven't seen it, there's a movie that you absolutely must watch called No End in Sight.
Mm-hmm.
It's a
I have
documentary.
not seen it. I have heard of it, though.
You need to watch it. You need to watch it. It is powerful. Powerful and accurate.
I will definitely add that to the watch list.
Yeah.
I'm mindful of our time now. I don't want to keep you for any longer than you're able to give me.
Yeah.
Do you have?
I have some more time.
Okay. So Saddam is toppled, and there's an insurgency that happens in Iraq. Fighters from outside the region come to Iraq and are fighting against the United States, as we're perceived as foreign invaders.
We're not perceived. We are foreign invaders.
Yes. Yeah. So this narrative ends up becoming really powerful. But how well did you and I guess other U.S. officials, obviously not the politicians in Washington, because they didn't seem to understand anything that was happening, but what was the reaction to this? Was it expected? Did you underestimate it? What was the feeling there?
Oh no, it was, well, first of all, the insurgency started even while I was there.
Hmm.
I had colleagues shot. I was almost shot. My bodyguard tackled me when I had a sniper dot on me. So, the insurgency started almost immediately. But the position here in Washington was these were dead enders. This was small. We didn't take it seriously because it went against the deeply entrenched narrative of how we were going to be perceived, how we would manage it, and how quickly we would get out. Rumsfeld even blocked a surge in those first 6 months. So the narrative was there isn't a problem. And if there isn't a problem, then we don't need to do anything about it. it was the first time I had seen ideology take over policy.
That's an interesting way to look at it. I mean, it's a problem that we are still living with today, unfortunately.
Oh, yeah, we are.
The lasting effects are,
oh, yeah,
20 years down the road, here we are.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of efforts you wanted to make in the reconstruction of Iraq seem to be undervalued by the DoD.
I was pulled out early. So any plans I had and anything I was trying to do, I was pulled out in May. But it was very painful to watch what happened. To know that there were people who were trying to make it work, but that there was just no way this was going to work. It just wasn't. And it wasn't going to work until the day that Bush fired Rumsfeld. We could start moving. That's when we got the surge, and, it got a little bit saner, but at that point the damage had been done.
That is a good segue to my last question.
Okay.
And thanks again for speaking with me. It's been such a pleasure. I've been looking forward to this conversation for weeks. So.
Oh, well, thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about something a little bit more philosophical in general. Today, the general public is paying particular attention to two major conflicts in the world. The United States isn't directly involved in any of these, but of course is involved indirectly.
Oh, yeah, big time.
Right. We have Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Hamas. And now I'm inclined to see these conflicts very uniquely and differently from one another. But I know that a lot of Americans and many others around the world have sort of adopted this notion that conflict is intrinsically wrong and that the immediacy of stopping it is always the first and best outcome. Now, you happen to be one of the few people in the world that's, has experience in the aftermath of conflict and been involved in resolution and reconstruction processes. And I wanted to ask you about the nature of conflict in diplomacy. Do you believe that there is ever a time and place for engaging in conflict? And then what is necessary to collaborate with a community that you have just been in conflict with to create stability and help people rebuild and improve their lives?
Well, first of all, that's a huge question. Second, you do know that I was in Kuwait when the Iraqis invaded.
Yeah.
And that I was a hostage for 6 months.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I was in Kuwait all the way through the occupation.
Wow.
As a hostage. And so in that sense, I have seen a large, aggressive military invade a smaller, relatively defenseless other territory, mount a version of ethnic cleansing. I sat there in Kuwait and watched it. So for me, when I see something like that happen, I lived that. Kuwait lasted 6 hours because it's that big. I did watch, certainly didn't have a part of it because I was otherwise occupied, the efforts that one of the lessons from Kuwait in 1990 is that there are times when an invader is not going to be dissuaded by sanctions or politics or diplomacy. And that sometimes you have to have Desert Shield, Desert Storm to get the bastard back out of the country. So there are times when, yes, military force is most regrettably required. The difference, one of the things that why Desert Shield, Desert Storm doesn't get as much attention is that it was successful. We're much better at talking about defeats than successes. The reason the Desert Shield, Desert Storm was a success and why even Ukraine is hanging on is not that sanctions and threats to the invader are necessarily effective. Putin was going to invade Ukraine irrespective. Saddam was going to invade Kuwait. Netanyahu was going to invade Gaza. I don't care who said what. In the case of Ukraine and Kuwait, these were diplomatic successes, believe it or not, because once the invasion happened, irrespective, and nothing was going to stop Putin and Saddam, we put together a diplomatic united front, one to create Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Armies of 35 countries showed up to liberate a country this big. That is an amazing feat, to put together that kind of a coalition that is that effective, that in 100 hours is able to get Saddam out. Ukraine and Russia were a little bit more complicated, but we put together this international coalition of sanctions and blockades and everything else, which has blunted Russia's capabilities, and also people providing military assistance, humanitarian assistance, economic assistance. So that is a major diplomatic success. Not sufficient, but if you didn't have that anti-Russia, pro-Ukraine coalition on finances and energy and oligarchs and absolutely everything else, and also providing weapons. If you just provided the weapons, it wouldn't be sufficient. So, first of all, Ukraine has to fight back, and we're helping, but it's bigger than that. Kuwait couldn't fight back, so 35 other countries showed up and did it for them. They deserved it. So sometimes, yes, you have to shoot back, but you can't just do it on your own. And I think for most countries, faced with that kind of a invasion, they need all the help they can get. That's where diplomacy comes in. In terms of reconstructing a country, some of it depends on how it was destroyed. And Iraq and Afghanistan are slightly different because we were the invaders. We were the destroyers. And so how you reconstruct somebody else's country while you're still occupying it, I don't think anyone's quite figured that one out. But the one thing I will say is that in any reconstruction that we've done, somebody else has done, it's a civil war, is the first thing is that you have to construct a legitimate governing structure. You have to provide basic services. And it sounds kind of silly, but you have to get the schools open and the trash collected. People have to see a government functioning, and it has to be stable, it has to be legitimate, and it has to be relatively free of corruption. It doesn't have to be a democracy in the sense that you have elections with political. That's out there. First, you need legitimacy. Then you can get to democracy. You need to provide basic services. And I think this is a big one. You don't do to, you do with. You build up the local capacity. You work with civil society. You work with whoever is left over from whatever the previous government was who is still useful. You don't fire the entire government as we did in Iraq. Not a good idea. So you build with the local capacity and the local legitimacy, and you build it up until it's providing the services and can increasingly grow out. You don't impose your structure. You don't impose your system. And if you want to look at one example, there are several examples out there where it did work. One of them is actually East Timor. And there's a wonderful case study on how you take a conflict-destroyed society and government and rebuild it. And I often have my students really study how the UN and Australia helped East Timor transition to being a viable country. And they had nothing going for them. A classic one is Japan. Sounds kind of silly, and I hope this doesn't sound right, but we let the Japanese be Japanese. Yeah. We kept the emperor. We kept the structure. We kept the culture. It was a light footprint occupation. And so it's work to build up, and don't go in to create in your image. And that's the shortest version of how you do reconstruction, is that you help the local people on how they want to be reconstructed. What are their priorities? What are their interests? Work with them, talk with them, listen to them, and help them reconstruct. You don't reconstruct. They reconstruct. You help.
The reconstruction has to begin with some level of trust again. So that makes total sense to me. Well, this has been an excellent conversation. I've loved this talk. So looking forward to having another conversation with you at some point in the future. But thank you so much for having a conversation with me, Ambassador. Thank you so much.
Okay, it's been a real pleasure talking with you, and truly it's been a pleasure.
Thanks.
So thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, have a good rest of your day.
Okay, bye-bye.